Everyone thinks war movies are immortal. Once they're made, they're here forever. Right? Wrong. Some of the most powerful war films ever created actually vanished, buried in archives, forgotten in vaults, or flat out destroyed, only to resurface decades later like cinematic ghosts demanding attention. And when they came back, they shocked historians and fans alike. So, what happens when a war story gets lost to time and then reappears? Let's dive into 10 films that refuse to stay dead. The Nanking Documentary, 1938. You've heard of lost cities, but have you ever heard of a lost documentary about one of the darkest events of the 20th century? That's exactly what happened with Nanking, a Japanese-produced film from 1938 that captured the infamous Battle of Nanking. For decades, the film was considered gone forever, a casualty of censorship and war. But in 1995, an almost complete copy surfaced in Beijing, shocking historians who thought they'd never lay eyes on it again. The surviving reels, though trimmed of around 10 minutes, still pack an emotional punch. What makes this rediscovery so chilling isn't just the images of war-torn China, but the eerie propaganda style, Japanese filmmakers framing devastation through their own lens of justification. Imagine finding a time capsule buried under rubble, only the contents are too raw and controversial to ever sit comfortably in a museum. That's Nanking in a nutshell. Clips now circulate on the internet, and every time they resurface, new debates explode. Was it propaganda? Was it history? The truth is, it's both. It's a reminder that film doesn't just preserve what happened, it also reveals what those in power wanted people to believe. And when footage like this re-emerges decades later, it forces us to wrestle with those uncomfortable truths all over again. For years, war movie fans assumed Nanking was just a whispered legend, an example of lost cinema swallowed by conflict. Its rediscovery wasn't just a cinematic win, it was a jarring reminder of how easily entire perspectives can vanish, only to return when we least expect it. Watching the fragments today is unsettling, almost like staring into a ghost of history that refuses to stay quiet. In short, Nanking isn't just a rediscovered war film, it's a confrontation with the past that still hits uncomfortably close. Moscow Strikes Back, 1942. When most people talk about Soviet war films, they think of grim black-and-white propaganda. But Moscow Strikes Back was different. This 1942 documentary wasn't just lost to Western audiences, it was buried under layers of Cold War tension and political hostility. The film was assembled right after the Soviets repelled Hitler's forces outside Moscow, blending frontline footage with fiery narration. At the time, it won an Academy Award for Best Documentary. And then, it practically vanished. For decades, Moscow Strikes Back sat in obscurity, screened only in rare Soviet archives, ignored by American distributors who didn't want to remind audiences that the USSR had played a pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany. That silence gave the film a ghostly aura. Was it real? Did it even survive? Then slowly, reels began turning up, and restored versions leaked online. Suddenly, people could see what wartime cameramen actually captured on the frozen steppes. The images are brutal. Soldiers trudging through snow, wrecked German tanks half buried in drifts, and faces of civilians who look half dead from hunger. And yet, in the middle of it all, there's defiance. A sense of we're not going anywhere that radiates off the screen. It's part war film, part survival story, and part political theater. Watching it now is like seeing the Soviet Union's version of a Rocky training montage, only with actual bombs falling in the background. The rediscovery of this documentary wasn't just about bringing an old film back into circulation. It cracked open a forgotten piece of World War II storytelling. Western audiences had been taught to see the war through a narrow lens, dominated by American and British victories. Moscow Strikes Back forced viewers to remember that the Eastern Front was hell on earth, and that without Soviet resistance, history might look very different today. Now available in digital form and clips spread across YouTube, Moscow Strikes Back proves that rediscovered war films aren't just dusty reels for scholars. They're living artifacts that challenge the stories we think we know. And once you've seen it, you'll never look at a history book quite the same way again. The Exploits of the Emden, 1928. If you thought silent films were all slapstick comedy and jittery jazz-age romances, think again. The Exploits of the Emden was an Australian war film about one of World War I's most dramatic naval encounters, the clash involving the German cruiser SMS Emden. At the time, the film was celebrated for using actual battle survivors and authentic locations. And then, like so many early movies, it disappeared. For decades, people assumed every frame had been lost to decay, but fragments survived. In dusty archives and forgotten cans of nitrate film, reels slowly resurfaced. Each rediscovered piece felt like pulling up wreckage from a sunken ship, damaged, incomplete, but undeniably real. Watching it today feels like peering through a cracked window at 1920s cinema, trying desperately to capture the chaos of WWII. Even though the surviving version is incomplete, those surviving clips carry weight. What makes it fascinating isn't just the battle sequences, but the context. Australia's film industry in the 1920s was tiny compared to Hollywood, yet here was a production tackling a world-class naval drama. And they didn't hold back. They staged battle recreations, recruited veterans, and leaned into a patriotic tone that made audiences cheer. When those reels went missing, it wasn't just the loss of a film. It was a cultural erasure for an entire generation of Australian cinema. Thanks to film preservationists, enough of the Exploits of the Emden resurfaced for clips to circulate online. And even though it's far from complete, the rediscovery adds a new dimension to war cinema history. It reminds us that forgotten corners of film history don't just vanish, they wait, quietly, until someone digs them up again. Watching it today is like shaking hands with the ghosts of filmmakers who thought they were making something permanent, never realizing how fragile permanence can be. Rediscovering the Exploits of the Emden proves that even the so-called minor war films can hold incredible historical value. Incomplete or not, it's a time capsule that demanded to be found. The Wooden Horse, 1950. Before The Great Escape made prison break movies a blockbuster staple, there was The Wooden Horse. Released in 1950, this British war drama told the true story of 3 POWs at Stalag Luft 3 who devised an ingenious escape plan. Every day they carried a hollow gymnastic vaulting horse into the prison yard, and while one man vaulted, others secretly dug a tunnel beneath it. Sounds almost ridiculous until you realize it actually worked. Here's the kicker. The Wooden Horse wasn't a massive hit in the United States. American distributors marketed it like a thrilling adventure yarn, but in reality, it was closer to a docudrama, restrained, methodical, and almost painfully realistic. Audiences expecting swashbuckling action left disappointed. Over the years, Prince faded into obscurity, overshadowed by louder, flashier escape stories. For decades, the film lived more in veterans' memories than in public conversation. Many who had endured POW camps swore this was the only escape film that truly captured the grinding monotony, the endless dirt shoveling, and the constant fear of discovery. And then, slowly, it returned. Film restorers unearthed clean copies, and clips began surfacing on television retrospectives and eventually online archives. Watching it today, the film feels like a secret handshake between survivors and viewers who crave authenticity. It doesn't glorify or exaggerate, it documents. And that's what makes its rediscovery powerful. In an era when war films leaned on patriotic fervor and big explosions, The Wooden Horse stood out as a quiet, determined story of endurance. Its return from obscurity proves that not every war story needs spectacle to matter. Sometimes the quiet ones, the ones built on patience, discipline, and sheer will, carry the heaviest weight. And thanks to its rediscovery, a new generation can see why veterans considered it the real deal. Fixed Bayonets, 1951. If you want grit, sweat, and realism in your war movies, look no further than Samuel Fuller's Fixed Bayonets. Fuller wasn't some Hollywood outsider cashing in on war films. He was a World War II combat veteran who knew firsthand what it meant to freeze, starve, and fight. And it shows. This Korean War drama, made on a shoestring budget, focused on a platoon of soldiers assigned to cover a retreat. Translation: they were essentially marching toward death. Shot mostly on a soundstage with crushed marble doubling as snow, the film had no right to feel authentic, but it does. Fuller cast Gene Evans, a real veteran, in the lead role, and his gruff, unpolished performance set the tone. The soldiers talk about fear, cowardice, frostbite, and death with a rawness most war films of the era avoided. No shiny heroics here. Just survival, moment to moment. So how did such a groundbreaking film vanish? Blame time and Hollywood politics. Fuller's reputation as a maverick meant his films often slipped through the cracks. Fixed Bayonets was remembered by a niche circle of cinephiles and veterans, but by the 1970s, prints had degraded, screenings were rare, and it seemed destined to vanish completely. Then came the rediscovery. Film preservationists, recognizing Fuller's growing legend, hunted down remaining prints. Restored versions hit festivals, DVD, and eventually the Internet. Suddenly, younger audiences could finally see why veterans swore the film was one of the most honest portrayals of rearguard duty. The U.S. Army even used clips to prepare recruits, not for tactical training, but for the psychological toll of combat. Watching it today, you feel the cold, the fear, and the fatalism in every frame. Its rediscovery wasn't just a cinematic revival, it was a cultural correction, giving Fuller his rightful place as a war film truth-teller. Dunkirk, 1958. Before Christopher Nolan turned Dunkirk into a thunderous IMAX spectacle, there was the 1958 British film Dunkirk, and for a while, this version was practically invisible. Despite being one of the biggest British productions of its time, it slipped into obscurity, overshadowed by later blockbusters and buried by distributors who didn't keep it alive in circulation. For decades, finding a copy was like finding a needle in a haystack. And then, slowly, it resurfaced. What makes this version fascinating isn't just its age. It tells two parallel stories. On one side, you have Corporal Tubby Binns, played by John Mills, leading a ragtag group of stranded soldiers behind enemy lines, scrambling to reach Dunkirk's beaches. On the other, you've got a civilian journalist back in Britain, Charles Foreman, played by Bernard Lee, trying to wake his countrymen to the urgency of the situation. Unlike the raw tension of Nolan's film, this version mixes battlefield grit with homefront politics. And here's the kicker. When it was first released, Dunkirk became the second highest-grossing film in the UK. Yet by the 1970s, it was forgotten. Critics dismissed it as old-fashioned, and reels just vanished. For decades, it was a phantom film, talked about in British film circles, but almost impossible to actually see. Then, preservationists pulled it back from the brink. Cleaned-up prints started circulating again, and now, thanks to restoration projects, you can find clips online and even complete screenings. Watching it today, the film feels less like a war epic and more like a national diary. It captures the dread of evacuation, but also the stubborn spirit that defined Britain's war effort. Its rediscovery doesn't just add a missing puzzle piece to cinema history, it gives us a chance to compare how two very different generations told the same story of desperation and survival. So while Nolan gave us a thunderous modern vision, the 1958 Dunkirk reminds us that long before Dolby Sound and IMAX, filmmakers were already capturing the chaos and nearly lost it to time. The Young Lions, 1958, Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, Dean Martin. You'd think a film with that powerhouse trio would never fade from memory. But The Young Lions, a World War II drama released in 1958, nearly did. Despite its star power, it slipped into obscurity for years, remembered more as a trivia question than a movie anyone had actually seen. The rediscovery of this film brought back one of the strangest war stories Hollywood ever put together. Brando played a German officer growing disillusioned with the Nazi cause. Clift portrayed a Jewish-American soldier battling anti-Semitism within his own ranks, and Martin played a nightclub singer drafted against his will. The film weaves their separate paths together until their fates collide in war-torn Germany. That kind of ambition should have cemented it as a classic. But the politics behind the camera nearly killed it. Brando hated the script. He accused 20th Century Fox of sanitizing his character to avoid offending West Germany during the Cold War. In protest, he rewrote his own dialogue on set, only to watch most of it get cut. Furious, Brando swore never to let a studio control him like that again. The film became less about the story on screen and more about the battle behind the scenes. By the late 1960s, The Young Lions had all but vanished from theaters and TV rotations. Critics ignored it, fans forgot it, and copies became rare. Then came the resurgence. Restorers dusted it off, and re-releases brought it back into circulation. Suddenly, viewers could see what Brando, Clift, and Martin had actually created, and it turned out to be more daring and nuanced than the studio ever admitted. Now, clips and restored versions are available online, giving new audiences a chance to rediscover this lost gem. Watching it today feels like unearthing a buried Hollywood experiment. Flawed, yes, but undeniably bold. The Desert Fox, 1951. Imagine Hollywood daring to portray a German general as a sympathetic figure, just 6 years after World War II ended. That's what happened with The Desert Fox, a 1951 biopic about Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. At the time, the idea was controversial, and over the decades, the film slipped into the shadows, half forgotten, half avoided. Its rediscovery forces us to wrestle with just how complicated war stories can get. James Mason played Rommel as a brilliant tactician trapped in a system he couldn't control, a man reluctantly dragged into the plot to assassinate Hitler. American audiences embraced it. Veterans respected Rommel as a strategist, and the film was a surprise box office success. But in Britain, it caused outrage. Veterans groups protested outside theaters, furious that a Nazi commander was being humanized on screen. The backlash left the film with a strange legacy. It became both popular and taboo, celebrated and buried. Over time, it faded from mainstream memory, surviving mostly in fragments and battered prints. For decades, The Desert Fox was whispered about but rarely seen. Then came its return. Restored versions resurfaced, making it available again, and suddenly, audiences could see just how daring Hollywood had been in 1951. Watching it now, you can feel the tension, a film walking a razor's edge between propaganda, biography, and moral gray zone. James Mason's restrained performance gives Rommel a dignity rarely afforded to Axis characters in that era. Rediscovered, the film reminds us that Hollywood has always had an uneasy relationship with war, balancing patriotism with the need to tell complicated human stories. The Desert Fox isn't just a war movie brought back from the dead. It's proof that even in the 1950s, filmmakers were already wrestling with questions we still debate today. Is it possible to admire the enemy without excusing them? Nanking, 1938, rediscovered 1995. History doesn't get more uncomfortable than this. Nanking, a Japanese documentary produced in 1938, vanished for nearly 6 decades. It chronicled the Battle of Nanking, one of the darkest episodes of World War II. For years, experts assumed the reels had been destroyed in the chaos of war or deliberately buried. Then, in 1995, a nearly complete copy surfaced in Beijing, sparking a storm of debates that still hasn't quieted down. Watching Nanking is like staring at history through a cracked mirror. On one hand, it's a visual record of a brutal invasion. On the other, it's propaganda, painstakingly crafted to present Japan's occupation as orderly and justified. That duality is what makes it so unsettling. You're not just watching war footage, you're watching a government try to control the story of war in real time. The rediscovery sent shockwaves through both academic and film circles. Some hailed it as an invaluable artifact, a rare chance to see events as they unfolded. Others condemned it, arguing that giving the film a platform risked normalizing propaganda. Either way, the conversation proved one thing. Lost war films don't just resurface as entertainment, they come back as cultural landmines. Clips from the restored reels now circulate online. They're grainy, fractured, but hauntingly vivid. Viewers describe the experience as eerie, like watching ghosts frozen on celluloid. You can feel the weight of what's missing, the unseen 10 minutes, the unrecorded atrocities, and that absence makes the film as important as what survives. The fact that Nanking reappeared at all is remarkable. It forces us to acknowledge that film isn't just a window to history, it's also a weapon. And once a weapon like this resurfaces, it can't be ignored. Attack 1956. Some war movies weren't buried in vaults, they were buried by controversy. Robert Aldrich's Attack from 1956 was one of the gutsiest American war films of its era. But because it dared to question military leadership and show cowardice among officers, the U.S. Army and Pentagon practically blacklisted it. No cooperation, no equipment, no support. For decades, the film was dismissed, hard to find, and pushed to the sidelines. Only later did it resurface as a cult classic. The story is brutal in its simplicity. Jack Palance plays Lieutenant Costa, a hardened soldier leading a platoon trapped by poor leadership. Eddie Albert, ironically a real-life decorated war hero, plays Captain Cooney, a coward who abandons his men in combat because of his political connections. As Costa's men are slaughtered, his fury builds, setting up a showdown between soldier and officer that feels more dangerous than the enemy outside. At the time, audiences didn't know what to do with Attack. It was too raw, too critical, and too unpatriotic for a 1950s America still basking in victory myths. Critics sneered, the Pentagon disowned it, and theaters quietly let it fade. By the 1970s, it had almost vanished outside of cinephile circles. Then came the rediscovery. Restorations and festival screenings brought it back, and suddenly, film historians started calling it one of the boldest war dramas ever made. Clips online now show Aldrich's clever camera tricks, like renting private tanks and staging combat with minimal resources, but it's the performances that linger. Palance is terrifying, Albert is despicable, and the entire film seethes with frustration at incompetent leadership. Watching Attack today, you realize why it had to be buried. It was too ahead of its time. It questioned authority, exposed corruption, and painted war as a machine that chews up the honest while protecting the connected. In an era of polished propaganda, that message was dynamite. Its rediscovery isn't just cinematic, it's political. It proves that even when films are silenced, truth finds a way back. So, what do lost war movies teach us? That history doesn't always vanish. It just hides, waiting for someone to dig it back up. From propaganda reels to gritty dramas and restored documentaries, each rediscovery forces us to rethink what we know. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this with a fellow film fan, and hit subscribe. Because if movies can come back from the dead, so can the stories behind them.